The silence had consumed 14 worlds by the time Dr. Sarah Chen's emergency training program reached full operation, and 32 locations across Kelthar space now housed teams of humans and aliens, working together with desperate focus, and each team had a human linguist paired with Kelthar priests, and they practiced the activation sequences until their voices synchronized perfectly and until every syllable of high etheric rang with the precision that ancient technology demanded. Sarah herself stood in the primary control chamber of the Sanctuary of First Light on Kelsith, and beside her high luminary, Zalkarith prepared to speak words that would either save their civilizations or prove meaningless against the approaching void, and the chamber walls displayed holographic connections to all 30. One other sights and showed the faces of humans and Kelthor and members of other Ascendancy species who had joined the effort. Captain Okonkwo watched from the Prometheus. Dawn positioned in orbit above, and he had both human and Kelthar vessels under his tactical command now, and a hastily assembled fleet that represented the military might of two species who had been enemies mere weeks ago. All stations report. Ready status. Marcus Webb called out from his coordination station 1. By 1, the teams confirmed their readiness, and Sarah saw Verlith at one location, an elder, Catherine at another, and dozens of humans whose expertise in dead languages had been considered impractical and useless by their own societies. Dr. Chen, the silence will reach the outermost defensive grid. Perimeter in 17 minutes, a Kelthar technician reported. Sarah took a deep breath and looked at Zalkarith, high luminary. The activation sequence requires us to speak in perfect synchronization for 4 minutes and 12 seconds, she said, and we cannot pause or stumble, and we cannot allow fear or doubt to break our concentration. Zalkarith's 6 eyes met hers, and something had changed in the alien's gaze since their first confrontation, and where there had been condescension now showed respect, and where there had been certainty now showed humility. I spent my life believing I understood the divine language, Zalkarith said quietly, and I was wrong about so much, and I was wrong about your species, and I was wrong about what it means to be civilized. And I will not be wrong about this. Sarah nodded and activated the synchronized countdown. All stations prepare to begin on my mark, she announced. Remember that every word matters and every breath matters, and we speak not for ourselves but for everyone who depends on us. The countdown reached 0. Sarah and Zalkarith began speaking together, and their voices harmonized in high etheric that flowed like music and carried mathematical precision. And across 32 worlds, other voices joined in creating a chorus that spanned light years. The Sanctuary of First Light responded immediately, and ancient systems that had slept for millennia blazed to life, and power flowed through conduits and energy built in massive capacitors, and the structure hummed with purpose. On the holographic displays, Sarah saw the other sites activating in sequence and saw light spreading from each temple, and saw the beginning of something extraordinary. But maintaining perfect synchronization across such distances required absolute focus, and Sarah felt sweat running down her face, and her throat began to ache, and beside her Zalkarith's skin color shifted with the strain. At the 90-second mark, a human linguist at one site stumbled over a complex conjugation, and the entire grid flickered. Station 7, maintain concentration, Marcus called out. You recovered well, and stay focused. The linguist steadied, and the grid stabilized. The 2-minute mark. Sarah saw the silence on the tactical displays, and watched it approach the perimeter, and watched reality itself dissolve before its advance. She kept speaking. At the 3-minute mark, her voice cracked slightly, and she forced herself to maintain the correct pitch and pronunciation, and every muscle in her body screamed for her to stop and rest. She kept speaking. Zalkarith beside her began to shake with effort, and its forearms trembled, and its breathing became labored, but it matched Sarah's cadence perfectly. At 3 minutes and 40 seconds, the grid reached full power. The holographic display showed energy building at each site, and saw connections forming between them, and saw a network of light spreading across Kelthar space like a web. At 4 minutes, exactly, the activation sequence ended. Sarah as Zalkarith stopped speaking simultaneously, and for a heartbeat, Nothing happened, and the defensive grid engaged from every temple world. Beams of pure, coherent energy lanced into space, and they wove together in complex, geometric patterns and formed a barrier that shimmered with colors beyond normal human ore. Kelthar's perception and the barrier expanded outward to meet the silence. Two forces collided. Reality screamed, space twisted and buckled, and stars flickered in and out of existence, and the Prometheus. Dawn's hull groaned under gravitational stresses that should have torn it apart. Captain Okonkwo gripped his command chair and watched his instruments go mad. All ships maintain position, he ordered, and trust the architects knew what they were doing. The defensive grid pushed against the silence, and neither force yielded, and the boundary between them crackled with energy discharges that could have vaporized planet Sarah. Stared at the tactical display and realized with growing horror that the grid was holding the silence at bay, but not pushing it back. It is not enough, she whispered. Saloth skin had gone pale purple with exhaustion. The architects built this defense to work, said so. There must be something more, and something we are missing. Sarah pulled up the beacon message again and searched for additional instructions and found a section she had dismissed as poetic preamble. The grid activates, but ascension requires unity of purpose. She read aloud, and what does that mean? Marcus was running analysis on the energy patterns. Sarah, the grid is drawing power from all 32 sites, but it is designed to handle more. He said, look at these throughput channels, and they are only at 60% capacity. Sarah understood with sudden clarity. The architects did not build this for one species. She said they built it for an alliance of species working together, and the Kelthar alone could never activate it fully because they were never meant to face threats alone. She pulled up technical specifications and saw the truth. The grid can accept input from any species that speaks. High etheric, she explained, and it becomes stronger with diversity and with different vocal ranges and with different ways of understanding the language. Aralith appeared on the holographic display. Then, we need more voices, said. But we have already mobilized everyone we can train. Captain Okonkwo spoke from the Prometheus Dawn. Not everyone, he said. Chen, can you create a simplified sequence that requires less training and something that people can learn in minutes instead of hours? Sarah thought frantically and began extracting key phrases from the activation sequence. I can create a support sequence, she said. It will not control the grid, but it will feed it additional power, and anyone who can pronounce basic high etheric can contribute. Send it to every ship in the fleet. Captain Okonkwo ordered and broadcast it to every Kelthar world within range, and we will turn every person into part of the defense. Sarah created the simplified sequence and transmitted it with pronunciation guides. Within minutes, hundreds of voices joined the chorus, and then thousands in crew members on warships spoke high etheric for the first time in their lives, and civilians on threatened worlds added their voices, and children repeated phrases taught by their parents. Defensive grid surged with new power. Barrier brightened and began to push against the silence. The silence pushed back harder. Sarah saw the energy readings climbing and watched the barrier expand and watched the darkness retreat centimeter by centimeter, but it was still not enough. Then something unexpected happened on the holographic display, and Sarah saw humans who had no linguistic training attempting to speak high etheric and getting the pronunciation wrong but continuing anyway, and saw Kelthar civilians whose dialects differed from the formal temple speech adding their imperfect voices, and the grid accepted them all. Every voice contributed, and every attempt added power, regardless of perfection. It is not about speaking perfectly, Zalkorith said with wonder. It is about speaking together. Sarah watched the grid transform and saw how the diversity of voices created harmonics that a single perfect pronunciation never could, and saw how human tonal ranges filled gaps that Kelthar voices missed, and saw how determination mattered more than technical precision. The defensive grid blazed brighter than any star. The silence retreated faster, and its edge collapsed inward, and reality reasserted itself in the spaces it had consumed. Then something else activated deep within the sanctuary of First Light, a chamber that Sarah had not known existed. Opened and revealed a device that looked like a crystalline tree, and its branches spread toward the ceiling and began to glow similar. Devices activated at every temple site. What is happening? Marcus called out. Sarah was reading new data that streamed. From the devices, the architects left more than defenses, she said with awe. They left a gift for species that proved worthy and for species that could work together. The crystalline trees projected energy upward, and that energy tuck. The Kelthar flagship trembled as it diverted course toward Kelsith, in the temple world where ancient technology had awakened without warning. And throughout the Grand Council chamber, accusations flew like weapons and elder priests blamed Dr. Sarah Chen for disturbing the sacred order, while younger scholars demanded to understand what was happening in High Luminary. Zalkareth struggled to maintain control. Sarah stood at a secondary console with Marcus Webb and Captain Okonkwo, and they watched data stream in from the activated device, and the structure called the Sanctuary of First Light was pumping enormous amounts of energy into a transmission that pierced through normal space and reached toward the galactic core can. You read what it is sending, Captain Okonkwo? Asked urgently Sarah's. Fingers flew across the holographic interface as she analyzed the signal pattern, and her face went pale. It is a beacon, she said, and the message repeats every 30 seconds. In high etheric, and it says, activation protocols initiated by authorized linguistic signature and requesting immediate assistance from Architect Network. Command and danger level critical. Marcus leaned closer to the display. Authorized linguistic signature, he repeated. Sarah, when you spoke high etheric correctly in this chamber, did you somehow trigger a response across all Architect devices? Before she could answer, the Kelthar technician called out new information. High Luminary, we are receiving reports from 6 other temple worlds, the technician said, and panic edged its voice. Ancient devices are activating on all of them simultaneously. The holographic display expanded to show multiple worlds and on each one structures that had been silent for thousands of years now, blazed with light and energy. Elder Kethrin pointed at Sarah with 3 of its 4 arms. The human has desecrated our holy places and awakened forces beyond our understanding, and this is why outsiders must never be permitted to approach the sacred mysteries. Vorolith argued back. Or perhaps this is proof that the human speaks truth and the devices recognize proper high etheric. Because they were built to respond to it, the debate intensified. But Sarah barely heard it because she was focused on translating more of the beacon message, and what she found made her blood run cold. Captain, the message is not just requesting assistance, she said quietly. It is warning of something called the silence. She pulled up the relevant section and translated it word by word. Architect Device Network has detected silence approach vectors and defensive grid activation required immediately in all species capable of high etheric comprehension. Must initiate protection protocols, Captain. Okonkwo gripped her shoulder. What is the silence? I do not know, but the architects feared it enough to build an automated warning system that survives across millennia. High Luminary Zalkareth approached. Their console and its hostility had transformed into something closer to desperate curiosity. You can read the full message, it stated, rather than ask. Sarah nodded and showed her translation, and explained that the Sanctuary of First Light and the other activated devices were part of a defensive network, defensive against what Zalkareth demanded, against something the architects called the silence, and I need access to more of your temple archives to understand what that means. Before Zalkareth could respond, alarms blared throughout the flagship in the main view screen showed something impossible. Space itself was tearing it. The edge of the Kelsith system reality rippled like water, and through those ripples came darkness that was not simply the absence of light, but the absence of existence itself, and stars disappeared as it spread and nebulae vanished. Even the cosmic background radiation ceased where the darkness touched. What is that? Someone screamed. Sarah stared at the phenomenon and understood with terrible clarity that is the silence. She whispered, that is what happens when something erases reality itself. The darkness expanded slowly, but inexorably, and the Kelthar sensor arrays could detect nothing. Within it, because there was nothing to detect, and any matter that touched its edge simply ceased to be panic, erupted across the flagship and Kelthur. Crew members rushed to their stations, while others froze in terror, and Elder Kethrin began chanting prayers in high etheric, but the words were wrong and mispronounced and offered no comfort. Captain Okonkwo activated his communicator. Prometheus Dawn, this is the captain and report status. His first officer's voice came through tight with, "Stress, sir. We are detecting the same spatial anomaly, and Earth's command is demanding answers, and they want to know if we should evacuate the system. Negative. We stand with the Kelthur, and Chen might be our only chance to understand what we are." Facing Sarah was already diving deeper into the beacon's message and pulling apart every phrase and searching for information about the silence and about the defensive grid and about what the architects had built to protect against this threat. Found a section that made her gasp. The defensive grid requires synchronized activation across multiple worlds, she said, reading quickly, and it needs operators who can speak Etheric fluently and maintain precise pronunciation for extended periods, and the architects designed it so that no single world could activate it alone to prevent misuse. How many operators? Zalkorith asked. Salakorith asked Sarah, did the calculations at least 30 individuals spread across the temple worlds, and they need to recite specific activation sequences simultaneously. Marcus saw the problem immediately, but the Kelthur priests do not speak high Etheric correctly, and their pronunciation is off by enough that the system probably will not recognize them. As authorized, Verlith stepped forward. Then teach us. Said simply, the human can speak it properly, so she can train others. Elder Kethron sputtered in outrage. You would place our salvation in the hands of primitives who learned our sacred tongue mere days ago. I would place our survival in the hands of anyone who can help. Verlith shot back. And my faith is strong enough to recognize truth regardless of its source. The silence continued to expand, and its edge had consumed 3 planets already and approached the 4th with methodical inevitability high. Luminary Zalkorith made a decision that would define its legacy. Dr. Chenet said formally, the Kelthur Ascendancy requests your assistance, and we ask that you teach us to speak high etheric, as the architects intended, and we ask that you help us activate the defensive grid, and we ask this as equals seeking partnership and survival. Sarah felt the weight of the moment and understood that she held the power to refuse and to let pride or revenge or simple pragmatism guide her choice, and the Kelthur had called humanity savages and threatened them with subjugation and had dismissed human achievements as crude fumbling. But she thought of all the innocent beings on those threatened worlds and thought of the principle that knowledge should be shared, not hoarded, and thought of what humanity valued most. The belief that intelligence and determination could overcome any obstacle when different peoples worked together. I accept, she said, but we will need help, and I cannot train 30 people in time alone. Captain Okonkwo was already on his communicator. Prometheus Dawn, transmit emergency message to Earth Command, and we need every linguist we have and every person with training in ancient languages, and get them here within 24 hours. Marcus began pulling up data on the temple worlds. Sarah, you should focus on training the Kelthur priests who are already stationed at each. Sight and I will help coordinate the human specialists when they arrive. Verlith moved to Sarah's side. I will learn from you and assist in teaching others, it said, and I will face the wrath of the elder priests if necessary. Elder Kethrin looked between them all, and its anger seemed to deflate into resignation. The silence does not care about our pride or our traditions, it said quietly, and perhaps that is the lesson the architects intended all along, and that true faith means accepting help regardless of where it originates. Sarah began organizing the training immediately, and she broke high etheric pronunciation into teachable components and created frenetic guides and recorded herself speaking the activation sequences, and the Kelthur proved to be quick learners once they accepted the need. But even as they worked, the silence continued to grow and consumed world after world and sent ripples through space that disrupted communications and navigation. And deep in the analysis of the beacon message, Sarah found something that terrified her more than the silence. Itself a final warning from the architects if defensive grid activation fails. The silence will continue until all advanced technological signatures and this galactic arm are eliminated and evacuation is not possible, and this network represents final hope. She looked at the spreading darkness, and at the frantic preparations, and at the alliance forming between humans and Kelthur, born from necessity and desperation. They had one chance, and if they failed, there would be nothing left to try again. The Grand Council Chamber of the Kelthur Ascendancy was built to inspire awe and fear in equal measure, and it occupied the central spire of their flagship and walls of crystalline material displayed the stars beyond, while holographic pillars showed the emblems of 27 member worlds, and at the far end sat the High Council itself with High Luminary Galcarith positioned at the center, flanked by 6 other priests, whose robes shimmered with symbols of rank and authority. Sarah Chen walked across that vast floor beside Captain Okonkwo, and she felt every eye upon her and felt the weight of countless years of Kelthur superiority pressing down like a physical force, but she kept her back straight and her mind focused on what she was about to do. Behind them, Marcus Webb carried the portable holographic projector that would display her evidence. High Luminary Zalcarith spoke first, and its voice filled the chamber with resonant harmonics. Humans, you requested this. Audience claiming knowledge of spiritual significance, it said. The High Council has granted you this honor despite your primitive status, and you may speak. But choose your words carefully, because blasphemy will not be tolerated. Captain Okonkwo began with diplomatic phrases and expressed gratitude for the opportunity and spoke of humanity's desire for peaceful understanding, but Sarah barely heard him because she was running through high etheric conjugations in her mind and preparing for the moment that would change everything. Then the captain gestured to her, and it was time. Sarah stepped forward and took a breath and spoke in. High Etheric's effect was instantaneous and electric, and every Kelthur in the chamber froze, and High Luminary Zalcarith, 6 eyes widened in shock, and several council members stood up from their seats. She had spoken the formal greeting reserved for those who addressed the divine, and had pronounced it perfectly. Impossible, Zalcarith breathed, and even its translator struggled with the emotion in its voice. No outsider has ever spoken the sacred tongue, and no primitive species possesses the spiritual advancement required to comprehend its mysteries, Sarah continued in high etheric. And she spoke slowly and clearly, and said that she came bearing knowledge that would benefit all Kelthur, and that humanity wished to share understanding of the architect's true legacies. Several council members began speaking at once, and their voices rose in anger and in confusion. But Zalcarith raised one of its forearms for silence. You speak the words, but do you understand them? It demanded. Any creature can mimic sounds, but comprehension requires enlightenment. Sarah smiled and switched to the human common tongue, so that her own crew could follow what came next. High Luminary, I not only understand High Etheric, but I can demonstrate that your priest caste has been misinterpreting it for generations, she said. The chamber erupted in outrage, but Sarah activated the holographic projector. Images appeared in the air showing side-by-side comparisons, and on the left were passages from the Litany of Creation as the Kelthar priest translated them, and on the right were Sarah's translations based on pure linguistic analysis. This passage, which you interpret as the God's blessing of eternal flame, Sarah said, pointing to the first example, is actually a warning about maintaining fusion reactor temperatures between specific parameters. She showed the mathematical formulas embedded in the text and demonstrated how the supposedly poetic language was actually precise technical terminology. This section you call the Prayer of Protective Barriers, she continued, is an instruction manual for activating defensive shield arrays. More examples followed, and each one more damning than the last. And Sarah showed how creation myths were actually terraforming procedures, and how divine commandments were safety protocols, and how holy prophecies were maintenance schedules. High Luminary Zalcarith, skin color shifted rapidly between purple and dark gray, which Sarah's research indicated meant severe emotional distress. You dare commit such blasphemy, said, but its voice lacked conviction. You dare suggest that the divine words are merely technical documentation? I suggest nothing, Sarah replied calmly. I demonstrate fact through linguistic analysis, and I can prove every translation I have. Showing she pulled up a new display showing the grammatical structure of high etheric, and broke it down into morphemes and phonemes and syntactic rules, and showed how it matched patterns from multiple Earth languages in ways that suggested either common origin or common design. Younger Kelther on the council named Vorlith leaned forward with what Sarah interpreted as intense curiosity. How did your species develop knowledge of high etheric independently? Vorlith asked. If what you say is true, then the implications are vast, Sarah agreed. And I do not claim to understand them all yet, but I can tell you that the architects who left these gifts were following linguistic principles that appear across the galaxy. She showed comparative data and displayed how advanced concepts could be expressed efficiently, using certain grammatical structures, and how mathematical relationships embedded themselves naturally into specific syntax patterns. Language is technology, Sarah said, and the architects were master engineers who understood that a well-designed language could preserve knowledge across millennia, even if the original context was lost. Captain Okonkwo stepped forward to support her argument. The Keltha have been faithfully maintaining architect technology for thousands of years. He said your priests performed the correct rituals, which were actually maintenance procedures, and you kept the systems running even without understanding the underlying science, and that is not weakness, but evidence of your civilization's dedication and discipline. It was a diplomatic way to frame the revelation, and Sarah appreciated the captain's skill. High luminary's Alcarith seemed to deflate slightly, and its rigid posture softened. If what you say is true, it began slowly, then our entire understanding of the sacred texts is incomplete but not wrong, Sarah interrupted. Gently, you preserved the knowledge even when you lost the context. And now humanity offers to help you reclaim that context. She pulled up images of the temple structures she had identified, and showed the inscriptions that labeled them as atmospheric processors, and communication relays, and terraforming reactors. Your holy sites are holy because the architects built them to last, all she said. They are wonders worthy of reverence, but they are also tools that can be understood and improved, and maintained with full knowledge rather than blind faith. Vorlith spoke again, and excitement colored its voice. Could you teach us to read high etheric as you do? It asked, could we learn to understand what our ancestors lost before? Sarah could answer. A commotion erupted at the chamber entrance, and a group of elder priests burst in, and their robes were more ornate than even the High Council members, and their skin showed patterns of ritual scarring. Eldest among them pointed at Sarah with visible rage. Heretic, it shouted, blasphemer who would destroy the foundations of our faith, and you council members who listen to this primitive poison should be ashamed. High luminary Zalcarith stood and faced the elder priests. Elder Kethron, these humans speak high etheric fluently, and they have translated passages that we have struggled with for generations. It said they speak lies wrapped in stolen holy words. Kethron retorted, and if we abandon our faith, we abandon everything that makes us. Cathor Sarah understood the danger and knew that. She stood at the intersection of science and faith, and that pushing too hard could shatter the Kelther society, and she spoke carefully. I do not ask you to abandon faith, she said in high etheric, so that all could understand. I ask you to deepen it through knowledge, and the architects left you gifts, and left you instructions, and left you a language capable of expressing the deepest truths of reality. And is it not more reverent to understand those gifts fully than to worship them blindly? The chamber fell silent as her words resonated. Then something unexpected happened. One of the holographic pillars displaying a member world's emblem began to flash, and an alarm sounded, and a Kelther technician rushed to a console. High luminary, we are receiving a transmission from the temple world of Kelsith, the technician said. One of the ancient devices has activated on its own. Every member of the council turned their attention to a new holographic display that appeared, and it showed a massive structure on a distant world, and high etheric symbols along its surface were glowing with increasing intensity. That is the sanctuary of First Light, Zalcareth said, and fear entered its voice. It has been dormant for 3,000 years. Sarah felt ice run through her veins because she recognized some of the symbols even from this distance. Device was not malfunctioning, it was responding. It was responding to the fact that someone nearby was speaking High Etheric correctly. For the first time in millennia, it was broadcasting something into deep space. Dr. Sarah Chen had not slept in 48 hours, and her quarters aboard the Prometheus Dawn had transformed into a chaos of holographic displays, showing linguistic patterns in ancient texts and alien symbols that danced in the air around her. Like luminous insects and coffee cups stood in towers on every available surface, and her eyes burned from staring at screens, but she could not stop, because she was close to something extraordinary. The high etheric script that High Luminary Zalkarith had transmitted with such arrogance had become her obsession, and she had broken down every symbol into component parts and mapped their relationships and compared them against humanity's entire linguistic database, and what she found defied all reasonable explanations, yet the evidence kept mounting. High Etheric was not as alien as the Kelthar believed. Sarah pulled up a display showing ancient Sumerian cuneiform beside High Etheric characters, and the structural similarities were undeniable. And then she overlaid patterns from Sanskrit and from Proto-Indo-European and from a dozen other Dead Earth languages, and the same fundamental grammar rules appeared again and again. "It's a constructed language," she whispered to herself, "but someone used the same linguistic building blocks that appeared on Earth." Her colleague, Dr. Marcus Webb, entered her quarters carrying fresh coffee and concern on his face. "Sarah, you need to rest," he said. "The captain extended your deadline to 5 days, so you have time." "No, Marcus. Look at this," she said, and gestured frantically at the floating displays. High Etheric uses a subject-object-verb structure, just like Latin and Korean, and the verb conjugations follow patterns identical to ancient Sanskrit, and the phonetic relationships match Proto-European sound shift rules. Marcus studied the displays, and his skepticism slowly transformed into amazement. "That should be impossible," he said, unless someone taught both civilizations," Sarah finished. "Or unless there is something fundamental about intelligent, I thought, that produces similar linguistic structures. Or unless we are missing something even bigger." She pulled up new data that made Marcus gasp, and these were High Etheric inscriptions that human probes had photographed from the hull of Kelthar vessels, and she had run them through analysis programs designed to detect mathematical patterns. "These are not prayers," Marcus Sarah said, and her voice shook with excitement. "These are formulas and equations and technical specifications." She showed him her translations, and where the Kelthar saw holy verses, she had found instructions for gravitational field manipulation and quantum state stabilization and dimensional fold calculations. "The priests do not know what they are reading," Marcus said in wonder. "They perform their rituals and operate their technology without understanding the science behind it." Sarah nodded and pulled up more examples, and she had found maintenance procedures disguised as ceremonial chants and safety warnings, written as divine commandments, and operational manuals formatted as creation myths. "The Kelthar have been treating a technical manual like a holy book for so long, they forgot it was ever anything else," she said. Captain Okonkwo arrived moments later, and he had clearly rushed from the bridge, and his uniform was disheveled. "Dr. Chen, the Kelthar just transmitted another ultimatum," he said. "They are giving us 2 more days before they enforce our subordination militarily, and Earth Command wants to know if we should retreat or call for fleet reinforcements." Sarah turned to face him, and her exhausted face showed fierce determination. "Captain, I can read their sacred language," she said, "and I can read it better than their own priests can." No. She demonstrated by pulling up a passage that the Kelthar had included in their transmissions as an example of divine wisdom, and she read it aloud in perfect High Etheric pronunciation, and then translated it. "What their priests think is a blessing from the gods about eternal light is actually a warning label about reactor core temperature limits," she said, "and what they think is a prayer for protection is an emergency shutdown procedure." Captain Okonkwo stared at the translations, and understanding dawned on his face. "If you can prove this to them," he said slowly, "if you can demonstrate that we understand their holy language better than they do it, we'll shatter their entire reason for calling us savages," Sarah finished. "They claim superiority through spiritual advancement and through their connection to the divine language, but we can show them they have been reading it wrong for generations." Raised a hand cautiously. "This could also start a war," he said. "We would be challenging the foundation of their entire society. And their priest caste derives all its power from being the only ones who can interpret high etheric. Sarah had considered this, and she knew the danger. But she also knew something else. There is more, she said, and pulled up images from deep space probes. I requested data from all our surveys of Kelthor space, and look at what we found on their colony worlds. The images showed ancient structures that the Kelthar had built temples around, and massive devices covered in high etheric inscriptions, and the aliens worshipped them as holy relics and offered prayers before them. Sarah had translated the inscriptions. This temple houses what they call the Eternal Provider, she said, pointing to one image. But the inscriptions identify it as an atmospheric processing station, and this shrine contains the voice of the ancients, but it is actually a communication relay. And this holy sanctuary protects the heart of creation, which is a terraforming reactor. Captain Okonkwo walked closer to the displays and examined each translation. They have been praying to machines, he said. They have been praying to machines. That still works, Sarah corrected, because the machines were built by someone who knew they would last for millennia and who left instruction manuals that would survive as religious texts. The architects, Marcus said, remembering the term from Zalkarith transmission. Sarah nodded and began pulling up more data about the mysterious precursor race that the Kelthor worshipped as gods. Every advanced civilization in this region has legends about the architects, she said, beings of immense power who shaped worlds and left behind wonders and then vanished into the cosmos. But they left a trail, Captain, Okonkwo said, understanding they left technology and language and instructions. Sarah confirmed, and they used linguistic structures that somehow mirror what developed independently on Earth, which raises questions I cannot even begin to answer yet. The three of them stood in silence for a moment and contemplated the implications. Finally, the captain spoke. Can you prepare a presentation? For the Kelthor High Council, he asked, can you demonstrate your knowledge of high etheric? In a way that is undeniable. Sarah smiled grimly. I can do better than that, she said. I can activate one of their holy relics and show them what it really is. Does Captain Okonkwo consider the risks and the potential rewards and made his decision? Do it, he said, but we do this carefully, and we offer this knowledge as a gift, not as a weapon, and we show them that. Humanity seeks partnership through understanding, not domination through superior knowledge. Sarah appreciated his wisdom and began preparing her presentation, and she selected the most dramatic examples and practiced her high etheric pronunciation until it was flawless, and she prepared backup data and contingency arguments for every possible objection. Marcus helped her create holographic visualizations that would make the translations clear even to those who wanted to deny them. 3 days later, Captain Okonkwo sent a message to High Luminary Zalkareth, requesting an audience before the High Council and claiming humanity had made a discovery of profound spiritual significance. Response came within hours. The Kelthor agreed to hear them, but warned that any attempted deception would result in immediate military actions. Stood before her mirror and practiced her opening statement in high etheric. One final time, and she thought about all the human linguists who had dedicated their lives to preserving dead languages and to understanding the structures of human thought through grammar and syntax. Those scholars had been called impractical, and their work had been considered useless compared to engineering and physics, but now their collective knowledge would be humanity's greatest weapon in the confrontation. Tecumseh took a deep breath and walked toward the shuttle bay, where Captain Okonkwo waited, ready to speak to the gods. He asked with a slight smile, ready to teach them grammar? She replied. The stars stretched endlessly before the Prometheus dawn as it sailed through the darkness between worlds, and Captain James Okonkwo stood on the bridge watching the view screen with practiced calm, though his heart beat faster than usual, because today would mark humanity's first meeting with an advanced alien civilization, and everything depended on making the right impression. The crew had detected the alien fleet 3 hours ago, and massive ships that dwarfed their exploration vessel hung in space like ancient cathedrals built from metal and light, and their surfaces shimmered with colors that human eyes had never seen before. And Captain Okonkwo had sent the standard greeting messages in mathematics and physics, hoping for a response that would bridge the gap between two species who had never known the other existed. When the response came, it was not what anyone expected. The alien ships moved with graceful precision and surrounded the Prometheus Dawn in a formation that was clearly meant to intimidate, and a message appeared on every screen simultaneously, and the translation software struggled to make sense of the complex language, but eventually words formed that made the entire bridge crew fall silent. Primitive vessel, identify yourselves, and state your purpose in Kelthor-controlled space, Dr. Sarah. Chen felt her hands grip the armrests of her station, and she was the chief linguist aboard the ship, and something about that message bothered her beyond the obvious condescension, because the grammatical structure seemed oddly familiar in ways she could not yet explain. Captain Okonkwo kept his voice steady when he replied, and explained that humanity came in peace and sought only knowledge and friendship. With other species among the stars, the response came faster this time, and with even less courtesy. You possess crude, faster-than-light capability, yet your vessel emissions indicate primitive power generation, and your hull construction shows no understanding of dimensional reinforcement, and you are savages who've stumbled upon technology you barely comprehend. The bridge crew exchanged glances, and anger mixed with confusion on their faces, because humanity had worked for generations to reach the stars, and they had overcome countless obstacles and solved impossible problems, and now these aliens dismissed all of it as the fumbling of children. Captain Okonkwo maintained diplomatic protocols despite the insult, and requested a face-to-face meeting to establish formal relations. What appeared on the viewscreen next would become burned into the memory of every human who witnessed it. And the alien, who materialized in holographic form, stood nearly 3 meters tall, with 4 arms arranged symmetrically, and skin that shifted between deep purple and midnight blue, and its face had 6 eyes, ranged in a triangular pattern. And when it spoke, its mouth revealed rows of crystalline teeth that caught the light. I am High Luminary Zalkurith of the Kelthor Ascendancy, and I speak for the 27 civilized worlds that comprise our glorious confederation, the alien said, and its voice carried harmonics that seemed to vibrate in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Humans have entered sacred space without permission and without understanding, and like animals. You know not what boundaries you cross, Doctor. Chen leaned forward at her station and watched every gesture and listened to every word, because this was what she had trained her entire life for, and understanding alien communication went far beyond simple translation and required grasping context and culture and the underlying frameworks of thought itself. High Luminary Zalkureth continued speaking, and explained that the Kelthar had observed humanity from a distance and found them lacking in all measures of civilization, and their art was crude, and their philosophy was simplistic, and their understanding of the universe was laughably incomplete. However, Zalkurith said, and its 6 eyes seemed to focus more intently, the Ascendancy is not without mercy, and we offer you a place within our confederation as a subordinate species, and you will provide labor and resources, and in exchange we shall guide you toward eventual enlightenment, though such a journey may take your kind many thousands of years. The insult was so enormous that several crew members stood up in protest, but Captain Okonkwo raised his hand for silence, and he had dealt with difficult negotiations before, and knew that anger would serve no purpose here. We appreciate your offer, the captain said carefully, but humanity seeks partnership between equals and not subordination. High Luminary Zalkurith made a sound that the translation software interpreted as laughter, though it sounded like crystal bells. Shattering equals, it repeated. You understand nothing of what that word means among the civilized galaxies, and equality is earned through spiritual advancement, and through understanding the sacred texts, and through speaking the language of the divine. Dr. Chen's attention sharpened at those words, and she began recording everything with renewed focus. Zalkurith explained that all truly advanced civilizations in this region of space belonged to the Ascendancy, and that they were united not merely by technology, but by shared faith and by shared understanding of the litany of creation in the ancient text written in High Etheric, that only the priest caste could read and interpret. Your kind cannot even perceive the most basic spiritual truths, Zalkurith said, and you have no concept of the divine language, and you cannot read the words left by the architects who shaped the cosmos itself. High Luminary transmitted a sample of high etheric script, and it appeared on the screens as flowing symbols that seemed to move and shift even as they remained static, and each character was impossibly complex and beautiful and utterly alien. But Dr. Chen stared at those symbols and felt electricity run down her spine, because somewhere, in the patterns and in the way the characters connected to each other, she saw something that should not be possible. She saw structure, she saw grammar rules. That reminded her of languages from Earth's. She saw mathematical relationships that matched linguistic frameworks she had studied in ancient human. Text Captain Okonkwo was speaking again and trying to negotiate for more time and for the opportunity to prove humanity's worth, but Dr. Chen barely heard him because her mind was racing through possibilities that seemed insane yet refused to be dismissed. Luminary Zalkarith gave humanity one standard cycle to accept subordinate status or face expulsion from this region of space, and possibly military enforcement if they proved stubborn. When the transmission ended, the bridge erupted in angry voices and discussions of military readiness and debates about whether to call for reinforcements from Earth. But Dr. Chen sat quietly at her station and stared at the high etheric script and began breaking it down into component parts and comparing it to every linguistic database in her files. Captain Okonkwo eventually noticed her silence and walked over to her station. Dr. Chen, he said, I need your analysis of their communication style and anything that might help us negotiate better terms. Sarah Chen looked up at him, and her eyes showed an intensity he had rarely seen. Captain, she said slowly, I think they are wrong about us, and I think they are wrong about themselves, and I think that sacred language they are so proud of is something I can learn to read. The captain frowned because that seemed impossible given what they had just heard in one cycle. He asked, Give me 3 days, she said, and I will show you something that will change everything. Captain Okonkwo looked at the determination in her face and made a decision that would alter the course of human history. You have your 3 days, he said. Make them count.